Hello. Welcome to the New Orleans Jazz Museum. On behalf of the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park, we're so delighted to have this partnership with the New Orleans Jazz Museum to provide free concerts for you throughout the week. The mission of the New Orleans Jazz National Historical Park is to instill a public appreciation for New Orleans jazz music, history, culture, and as well be a global leader in promoting, protecting, and preserving this American art form, which is jazz. New Orleans is the birthplace and the birth city of this great American art form. And so throughout the week we have free concerts. On Tuesdays and Thursdays we have our programs here. Wednesdays and Fridays we have our programs down at 419 Decatur. And on Saturdays we have our music programs at 916 North Peters. And so on every Thursday we have the piano hour, and we feature pianists that are not only from the city but are from around the world that specialize in promoting the New Orleans jazz tradition, New Orleans traditional piano. And so we have a great pianist that has been all over the world and has spread this great genre of music. And so please help me introduce and welcome up Tom Hook.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon, folks. My pleasure to be here. Now, the song I just played for you is a song called Unter dem Doppel Adler. It's an Austrian march written by a man named W.H. Krell. So you're asking yourself, well, if this is a program about New Orleans jazz, why is he starting with an Austrian march? It's really simple. The music that was the building blocks of music that became jazz was European dance music, because, you know, New Orleans was probably the most European of American cities, founded by the French over 300 years ago. During the course of its lifetime, it was a French city, a Spanish city, a British city, an American city. As one of the largest ports in North America, it had a huge population of people from all over the world, all over Western Europe, a lot of German, a lot of Irish, a lot of Sicilian people settled in New Orleans. And of course, you had a huge amount of people of African American descent here as well. So it was really a place where all of these European cultures came together. Now, New Orleans is a very small city, surrounded by water on all sides. You can only get so big. So this population was very densely compact, people from different countries living right on top of each other. And it also is a place that has always had a tendency to celebrate. Because of our French heritage, we're fond of saying New Orleans has a tremendous amount of joie de vivre, joy of life. We're fond of saying that New Orleans is the city that put fun in funeral. Fun, funeral. It's true. And it's any given weekend in New Orleans, there's something going on, some kind of a parade or a festival or some kind of an event, and it's always been that way. So all of these different cultures had celebrations, music, dances, parties going on all the time. And these musicians from all these different countries started to share and play each other's music, and there was a real melding going on. But one of the most important things that happened to this European music was the addition of a device that come to us from Africa, African culture, and that's the rhythmic device of syncopation. In European dance music, the rhythms are all pretty rigid, like in a march. 1, 2, 1, 2, doesn't vary much, even in a waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Very even rhythm, that's characteristic of European music. In African music, it's not even rhythm, it's uneven rhythm. It's what we call syncopated rhythm. So a European piano piece might sound like. You take the same thing and you syncopate the rhythm, it sounds like this. Hear the difference? Syncopation. That syncopation started to make its way into American music in the 19th century. And one of the earliest forms was by taking a march, like the one I just played for you, by Krell from Austria, and syncopating the rhythms, and turning it into a style of music that we called the cakewalk. Cakewalk was one of the most popular musical forms all through the 19th century in the minstrel show, which was the most popular form of music for people. And it's basically a march that's syncopated. So this is what cakewalk sounded like. And cakewalk actually evolves from a dance that evolved in the plantation culture, where the slaves would actually dance on weekends, and they'd have these elaborate dances that they do, and then they'd have a contest, and the winner would win a prize, and the prize was a cake. That's why it's called a cakewalk. That's why we as Americans say, if something's really easy or it's great, it takes the cake. That's what it comes from, cakewalk. So this is a cakewalk. This one written by Carrie Mills. It's called At a Georgia Camp Meeting. Cakewalk. Thank you. People really like this new way of playing down here. They said, I like that uneven tempo. I like that ragged time. Ragged time became ragtime, of course. Ragtime is the grandfather of jazz. Ragtime came along in the 1890s, and it was really just cakewalk music that was even more syncopated. I'd like to give you an example of ragtime by playing what's considered to be the first ragtime song, written in 1897 by a man named W.H. Krell. We know it's the first ragtime song because when we look at the sheet music, it says, the first ragtime song. It's a dead giveaway right there. It's called the Mississippi Rag. And all of this music that I'm playing for you, we know was music that was building blocks because the biggest band leader in New Orleans in the 1890s was a man named John Robichaux. John Robichaux was born in Thibodaux, Louisiana in 1866. He moved to New Orleans and started playing in some of the brass bands and society orchestras in town, put together his own society orchestra, and he had the #1 orchestra. His music is all housed at the Hogan Jazz Archive at Tulane University. So I went to Tulane, I got his music, I pulled it out, and I looked at what he was playing in the 1890s, and all of these songs were in his library. So we know that this was the music that if you went to a party in New Orleans, the band would be playing these songs. So with no further ado, this is the first ragtime song, Mississippi Rag, 1897. Thank you. Isn't that cool? So you're probably thinking to yourself, when you're talking about ragtime, what about Scott Joplin? I thought Scott Joplin was the king of ragtime. He was. Scott Joplin was indeed the king of ragtime. Born in 1868, the son of slaves, Joplin spent most of his career traveling around the country, playing in minstrel shows, playing in saloons, developing this new kind of music. In the 1890s, starting in 1894, he lived in a town in the heart of Missouri called Sedalia, which is not far from the Missouri River, right on the railroad between Kansas City and St. Louis. And while he was there, he was influenced by this music that he heard coming up from New Orleans. Because you see, the internet of the 19th century was this Mississippi River out here. Everything traveled up and down the Mississippi-Ohio River system. Music, cotton, people, hogs, corn, culture, everything, up and down the river. What happened in New Orleans was soon happening in St. Louis, Kansas City, Chicago, St. Paul, Chattanooga, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Nashville, all the rivers of the river system, and all this traveled up and down on boats, up and down the river. That's where Joplin heard this new music coming up out of New Orleans. He was influenced by this syncopated music, and he wrote some rags. In 1899, he wrote a song called the Maple Leaf Rag, named after a saloon he was playing in called the Maple Leaf Saloon. That became the most popular ragtime song ever written. It sold over 1 million copies, the first piece of sheet music to sell 1 million copies. By 1909, it had sold in 10 years 1 million copies. And Scott Joplin made 1 penny for every copy of the Maple Leaf Rag, which wasn't bad because it sold for 5 cents. So that's 20%. That's not bad for a musician, even today. So this song took the country by storm. Ragtime became a craze because in 1904, they had the St. Louis World's Fair. You know, meet me in St. Louis, Louis, meet me at the fair. St. Louis World's Fair. Joplin played piano at the St. Louis World's Fair on the concourse outside the fairgrounds, and people gathered by the thousands to listen to this new music. Ragtime became a national sensation. And this is the song that is the most popular rag of all. It's Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag. Maple Leaf. So people were going crazy for ragtime. But down here in New Orleans, these musicians down here, they weren't leading it just alone with ragtime. They started to change the music even more. And it's because a lot of people think that New Orleans had such a huge Creole population. Creole comes to us from the Spanish word criollo. It means mixed. You have Louisiana Creoles and French Creoles. Creoles are people from France or of French heritage born in the New World or people of mixed race. And New Orleans had a huge population of Creoles. About half the city was Creole in the late 19th century. And they were very wealthy people. They owned beautiful homes and plantations. They sent their children to school in Europe, and they came home with this wonderful musical knowledge. And they started to incorporate music from their heritage, which was European and African and Spanish. And something new was happening to this music. So these Creole musicians had a lot of liberty to invest in and create a whole new sound. What they started to do is take these rags and they started to add a new element, and that element's the blues. The blues comes to us from Africa, descended from call and response singing that came over with the West African culture. And in that culture, there's a leader of a group, and he sings out a line, and the group responds. He sings out a line and a group responds. He sums up his feelings and then he sings out a line, the group responds. That's why in a blues, the first two lines always repeat, call and response. So for example, he might say, Iko B-I-A, and the group says, Iko B-I-A. He says, Yo B-I-A. They say, Yo B-I-A. He says, Ule babale, Ule babale. Iko B-I-A, Iko B-I-A. Call and response. You've done this before, obviously. Okay. So at blues, the first line always repeats, like, nobody knows the way I feel this morning. The response, nobody knows the way I feel this morning. And nobody knows why I crave to see that woman laying in her grave. Lord, nobody knows the way I feel this morning. Call and response. But blues is more than just a set of lyrics. It's also a special scale. If you've had music lessons, you know that in the Western world, we have basically two scales we use, a major scale and the harmonic minor scale. Blues uses a special scale that's a combination of both major and minor. So you end up with major chords with minor notes inside of them, and those notes are called blue notes. Nobody knows the way I feel this morning. That note, that's a blue note. Nobody knows the way I feel this morning. Flatted third inside of a major chord. Blue notes. Usually in a blues, it's a flatted third, a flatted fifth, and a flatted seventh. There is going to be a quiz, so I hope you're taking close notes on this. So they started to add these new harmonies to these rags. Something else was happening. And then they started to incorporate Latin rhythms into the music because New Orleans was a Spanish-controlled city for about 40 years, from the 1770s up until the Louisiana Purchase. It was run by Spain. And so there's a lot of Spanish influences in New Orleans. It was always the largest slave port in this part of the hemisphere. A huge amount of slaves came into New Orleans from South America, from Central America, from the Caribbean, and they brought with them Latin music. And so those rhythms made their way into the music as well. So you started to hear all of these elements in one piece. I'm going to play an example for that for you by a guy named William Christopher Handy. Now, W.C. Handy was the father of the blues. He was born in 1873 in Florence, Alabama, and he went to Memphis later in his career after traveling all over the country. And Handy, as he traveled around the country in these minstrel shows, would listen to the music that he heard people singing, and he remembered it. And he was in Memphis as a successful band leader, and a guy was running for mayor named Crump, and he asked him to write him a campaign song. Handy realized most of his constituency were African Americans, so he said, I'm going to use a blues format. So he took a blues that he had heard somewhere, put some lyrics to it, and they published it, and it helped Crump get elected. It sounded like this. Mr. Crump don't allow no easy riders here. It repeats, Mr. Crump don't allow no easy riders here. I don't care what Mr. Crump don't allow. I'm going to Jelly Roll anyhow. Mr. Crump can go catch himself some air. That song helped get Crump elected, and it was so popular, Handy realized I should publish this. So he changed the words. He published it as the Memphis Blues in 1913, and it sold thousands of copies. It was a huge success, so much so that he did another composition the next year of a song he'd learned while he was in St. Louis, sleeping underneath the Eads Bridge because he was down on his luck. And he heard the working girls who were on the streets sleeping under the Eads Bridge, who had no place to stay that night. And when I mean working girls, I'm not talking about stenographers here. I'm talking about working girls. And this is a song they sang. And so he wrote this down and published it. This became one of the most recorded, most popular songs in all of American music. It's called the St. Louis Blues. And it's got a Latin rhythm. St. Louis woman with your diamond rings, drag your man around with your apron strings, one for powder and your store-bought hand. A hard-working man, but never go nowhere, nowhere. Baby, I had to see the evening sun go down. I hate to see the evening sun go down. Since that St. Louis woman left this town, if I'm feeling tomorrow like I'm feeling today, feeling tomorrow like I feel today, gonna pack my grip, make my getaway. I got the St. Louis blues, I'm as blue as I can be. My heart like a rock, been cast to sea. Since that mean St. Louis woman made a fool out of me. Since that mean St. Louis woman made a fool out of me. So where did this Latin music come from? W.C. Handy learned that from the New Orleans piano men, and I'm going to play a song for you right now that was one of the first instances where you hear all this rolled together. Way back in 1902, there was a piano player from New Orleans named Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe. He lived right here on Frenchman Street, right here. If you leave the Mint and you go up Frenchman, he lived right on Frenchman. And he was a Creole piano player. He spent most of his early career playing in the sporting houses of Storyville, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But he took and wrote a song in 1902 that was basically a European-style dance piece with syncopation, blues, harmonies, and Latin rhythms, and he called it the New Orleans Blues. So if you want to pick a song that sounds like the very beginning of jazz, to me, this is it. This is Ferdinand Joseph Lamothe's New Orleans Blues, 1902. cool? New Orleans Blues, Ferdinand Joseph Lamont. He played in these sporting houses over here in Storyville. Storyville was just on the other side of Basin Street, which was parallel here to this street that runs right here, parallel to the river. That was in the late 19th century. The French Quarter was the nice part of the city, and the other side of Basin was the not so nice part. That's where the city fathers decided to put all of the sporting houses. And for those of you that don't get out much, a sporting house is a place where you would go and buy sporting goods of a sort. It's where all the bordellos were. That's where they were. All the cribs and all those in Storyville. And all of those places had piano players who would play for the girls to come down and demonstrate their wares to the potential buyers. That's where Ferdinand Lamont worked there, and that's where a lot of this music evolved, in Storyville. Now, you probably know Lamont better by his stage name, Jelly Roll Morton. Jelly Roll was one of the great early piano players, one of the great early band leaders in New Orleans. In fact, back in the day, there were 3 great bands in New Orleans: Jelly Roll Morton's Red Hot Peppers, King Oliver's Creole Jazz Band, which featured eventually a talented young kid named Louis Armstrong on second cornet, and the third band was the original Dixieland Jazz Band, which had the first gold record in 1917, their recording of Livery Stable Blues on one side and Tiger Rag on the other. First gold record, and they were from New Orleans. Interesting thing about them, it was a band composed entirely of Sicilians. Everybody was playing jazz in New Orleans in those days. Original Dixieland Jazz Band. But Jelly Roll, he was a great piano player and a great composer. He did an interview for the Library of Congress in 1937, and in that interview he talked about he himself had personally invented jazz. He was that guy, and he demonstrated some of his tunes. One of them was this song he recorded in 1923, but he said he wrote it back about the same time that he wrote New Orleans Blues. It's an example of a New Orleans-style rag. Now, you remember Scott Joplin's Ragtime. Very correct, very European-sounding, very polite. New Orleans Ragtime is a little bit more raw, a little more primal. In fact, this one I like because it does this. It's written in the music that way. There's a line with an X. It says, forearm smash. That's supposed to be the sound of Grandpa having a spell. The name of the song, Grandpa's Spells, Jelly Roll Morton. You know, folks, I spent 4 years of my life in a conservatory, and this is what I do for a living. My mother is very proud. Jelly Roll. Yes, indeed. Morton was quite a character, a great composer, years and years ahead of his time. But something happened. This music down here in New Orleans was evolving, turning into its own thing. They started to take all of these rags and started to add blues to them. They started to add Latin rhythms to them. They started to improvise, taking existing melodies and then creating new melodies spontaneously over the top of the chord changes, improvising new melodies, which was they called jazzing the rag. Now that wasn't really new. People had been improvising melodies for years. It's not unusual in classical music for anybody during a sonata to play a cadenza of some fantastic thing they improvised. But no one had ever had the audacity to have everybody in the band improvise simultaneously. The trumpet player would play something, the clarinet player would say, oh yeah, let me do this, man. And the trumpet player's like, oh, how about this, man? And then the piano player's like, well, let's do this. And the banjo player's, okay, that's cool, let's do that. So it just constantly evolved, improvisation, and that was what really makes jazz special. It's improvisation. If you play a jazz song exactly the same way every time, it isn't jazz. Jazz is all about improvisation. So Jelly Roll was one of those guys. Now, this music, as I said, was here in New Orleans, and it could have stayed in New Orleans, but in 1917, something happened. If you remember your American history, you remember that the Great War started in Europe in 1914. We didn't get involved until 1917, when finally we started to send troops to Europe. So soon there were all these American farm boys and boys from the heartland coming into New Orleans on troop trains, getting off of the troop train, getting onto troop ships, and then shipping off to the battlefields of Belgium and Flanders and France to fight in the First World War. The problem was the train station was right beside Storyville. So these boys would get off of the troop train, they'd go into Storyville, then they'd get onto the troop ship with something that they didn't have when they got off of the troop train. Venereal disease was rampant in the American Expeditionary Force from New Orleans, so much so that the Secretary of the Navy shut down Storyville, closed it down. So all of those people that worked there, all the girls and their managers and all the musicians, had to find someplace else to go. So over the next few years, they left New Orleans and basically they went to Chicago. And then from Chicago, they spread out all across the country. That's what King Oliver did, that's what Louis Armstrong did, that's what Jelly Roll Morton did. They went to Chicago, and then they spread out. So that by the end of the 1920s, jazz was all over the country, indeed all over the world. The 1920s is known as the Jazz Age, because it was worldwide. Jazz got really, really popular. And all these young musicians came along and started improving the music and creating new music of their own. There was a really talented piano player from Baltimore who settled in New York in the early 20s and started playing at the Cotton Club in Harlem. His name was Duke Ellington, and he was a genius, handsome, wrote wonderful music, years ahead of his time, and people loved him. And Jelly Roll Morton was offended. He said, look, I invented jazz, and then here's this kid comes along, and they call him Duke Ellington. He said, well, if there can be a Duke Ellington, there can be a Jelly Lord. So he wrote a song about himself and called it Mr. Jelly Lord. In this song, he claims that he's playing for the King and Queen of England. As far as anyone knows, he never left North America, but that's just Jelly for you. 1926, Mr. Jelly Lord. In foreign lands, far across the sea, they knight a man for bravery. Make him a count or a duke, you see. Must be a member of the royalty. Ah, but Mr. Jelly Roll would sing in the temple for the king and queen. All at once he struck a little harmony chord. The king said, make Mr. Jelly a lord. Mr. Jelly Lord, you're sitting at your old keyboard. Watch him toil, plays jazz music as a rule. Sits upon the stone that old piano stool, plays melodies, strokes the ivories, plays lovely little chords. Now at home as well as a bride, they call him Mr. Jelly Lord. That's right, call him Mr. Jelly Lord. when Jelly struck his old hometown, all the folks gathered round. They said, Mr. Jelly, you're so grand, gonna make you king of Dixieland. But you know that the laws ain't fair. They ain't treating you on the square. Preacher said, man, if we can't make you the king, least we can do is make you the mayor. Mr. Jelly Lord, you're sitting at that old keyboard, playing jazz music as a rule. Sit on that old piano stool, playing melody, stroking the ivories, plays lovely little chords. Now and home, as well as a broad deck, called him Mr. Jelly Lord. That's right, they call him Mr. Jelly Lord. Jelly Roll. Jelly was in Washington, D.C. for that interview with Alan Lomax in the Library of Congress in 1937. And if you ever have 3 or 4 hours of your life to dedicate, I recommend you listen to it. He's an amazing storyteller, very braggadocious. He plays, he talks all about the early days. It's really fascinating. And while he was in Washington, he was playing in a club in 1939, and he got involved in a fight with a guy, and he got stabbed in the chest. So they put him in the car, they rushed him to the hospital, but they wouldn't take him because he was a Creole. So they put him back in the car. He went down to Maryland. They did manage to take him and get him fixed up, but the damage had been done. He never fully recovered from that incident. He moved to Los Angeles for his health, where he ultimately passed away in 1941 at the age of 51 years old. The story of Jelly Roll Morton has kind of been forgotten over the years. He was one of the great pioneers of American music. A lot of people don't know much about him. That's one of the reasons why I like to talk about Jelly. One of the last songs he wrote was a beautiful little tune. He always wanted to be a popular Tin Pan Alley songwriter, you know, like Irving Berlin. He wrote a lot of jazz songs, but not too many popular songs. And so here it is, 1939, and he's writing songs. But you've got guys like Cole Porter and Johnny Mercer and George Gershwin, people writing songs like that, and he just really couldn't compete. But he did write this tune, which I think is a charming little tune. It's his last composition. It's called Sweet Substitute. I don't think it's about saccharin. My gal went away, said she knew I'd miss her every night and day. I just had to get a look around. Boys, you see just what I found. I found my sweet substitute. Love my substitute. She tells me that she's mine, all mine. Does anything I tell her, sweet love is blind. She's got such loving ways, puts my head in a daze. My new recruit, she mighty cute. I'm crazy about my substitute. Don't want no regular, crazy about my substitute. She's got such loving ways, puts my head in a daze. My new recruit, she mighty cute. I crazy about my substitute. Don't want no other. Crazy about my sweet substitute. The music of Jelly Roll Morton. Thank you. Mark Twain said, it's a terrible death to be talked to death, so I'm not going to do that to you. I'm going to play one more tune for you, though. I talk about a style of music that kind of led to the music that was to come along in the 1950s. After swing music came along and jazz was popular, then in the 50s, a new thing happened where the music that had been played on what they called race records, which was confined to African-American artists, was suddenly being performed by white artists in the 1950s by guys up in Memphis and in Nashville. And that suddenly became accessible to a whole generation of Bobby Soxers, and a new era was born. And a lot of that music was based on a blues style that evolved in the Deep South in turpentine camps. Back in the early 20th century, even today, there's a vast pine forest that stretches from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Mississippi. And as this country was growing in the 20th century, we needed lots of lumber and lots of turpentine and paint. So these big companies like Georgia Pacific would actually carry refineries with them on train cars, and they'd build railroad tracks and cut down trees and process that material. Then they'd lay more track, get down more trees, send more lumber and more turpentine, cut down trees, send it back. As they're chewing their way through this pine forest, eventually they ended up miles and miles away from the nearest town with a couple of hundred young lumberjacks in these camps with nothing to do on the weekend. And these guys figured out, you know, if we take an empty boxcar and we put a piano in there and get a barrel of rot gut whiskey, we can make all the money that we pay these guys on Friday back from them on Saturday. And that's what they did. And a style of music evolved in the turpentine camps that took its sound from the fact that they were always around locomotives, and it sounded like this. They called it boogie woogie. The special rule about boogie woogie is there are 8 notes played in the left hand in every measure. Boogie woogie boogie woogie boogie 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 woogie boogie. It was a very popular style all through the 30s, kind of anti-swing. There were 2 camps. There was a guy named Don Ray who wrote a song. He was in the Jimmy Dorsey band. He called it Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B. It was recorded by some girls from Minnesota named the Andrews Sisters. And they also recorded this other tune that came from the Dorsey band. One of the things they used to shout when the piano player was playing Boogie Woogie, they'd say, when the man plays with the bass and guitar, the people all holler, Daddy, beat me 8 to the bar. Beat 8 to the bar, that's what that means. So let's try that. When the man plays with the bass and guitar, they all holler, beat me, Daddy, 8 to the bar. That's your part. Beat me, Daddy. 8 to the bar. Perfect. There's a little honky-tonky village in Texas, got the best piano player by far. He plays piano anywhere that you like it. The way he plays it best is 8 to the bar when he jams at the bar. He's the daddy of them all. People gather around when he gets on to stand. When he plays, it gets the big end. Plays the rhythm and the cats and trance, and nobody there bothers to dance. And when the man plays the bass and guitar, they holler, beat me, Daddy, 8 to the bar. Plink it, man, plink it, little brother, plunk the keys. Rip, rap, rip, rap, ripping it with ease. When the man plays with the bass and guitar, they holler, beat me, Daddy, 8 to the bar. gather round when he gets on. When he plays it, it's a big hand, plays the music, puts a cats in trance, and nobody there. Ask him to dance, and when the man plays with bass and guitar, they holler, beat me, daddy. A to the bar, plank it, man, plank it, little brother, plunk the keys. Rippin', rappin', rippin', rappin', rippin' it with these. When the man plays with the bass and guitar, they holler, beat me, daddy, A to the bar. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been my pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I hope you have a great visit to New Orleans, Louisiana. My name's Tom Hook. Have a great day. Bye-bye. There is going to be a test. 8 to the bar. You got that part right.